So the nasal spray actually has concentrated formulation of what's called nanobodies, which are essentially like antibodies on a smaller scale. They're manufactured by genetically engineering yeast or bacteria to make them basically nanobody factories. And what they do is two functions. One is that they bind to the spike protein. That's the part that the virus uses to get inside human cells. And they basically kind of put a cover on it. So it's not able to interact with the receptor, the ACE2 receptor, to get into the human cells. And the second is they actually lock that spike protein into an inactive form. So they make it inactive, not just by covering it, but also by changing the structure of that protein so it no longer works. And what the studies have found, according to these UCSF scientists, is that these are incredibly effective at preventing the coronavirus from entering into the human cells. Because remember, the way that viral replication works, you get exposed to a small amount of virus, it then enters into the host cell and turns the host cell into a coronavirus factory. If it can't enter into the host cell, that small amount of virus can quickly get cleared away and prevent infection.
Okay, now they were kind of referring to this as another form of PPE. Can you see it being something like that?
So that's an interesting way to talk about it. And I'm not sure I would necessarily compare it to PPE, but I think what's the most apt analogy is something we call post-exposure prophylaxis. So that means it's not going to replace PPE, but let's say there was a hole in your mask that you didn't notice, or somehow you got exposed to something by accident. This would be a really important intervention for post-exposure prophylaxis to prevent infection in those individuals that have been exposed. So certainly not a replacement for PPE, but I can see it being an adjunct when PPE fails. Oh, sorry, Mike, you're still muted.
So I guess my question is also, like, how can you see this best being utilized? What would you see as like the best plan of action in the fight against coronavirus?
So I would say until we have a vaccine available, this technology, if it proves to be successful in human trials, which we haven't done yet, but if it is indeed successful in preventing coronavirus infection, could be a really useful what we call plan B. So if you need a backup plan because you got exposed to the virus, this would be a really helpful way to try to prevent infection to those individuals that are exposed. And you can imagine that even if it's incompletely effective, in other words, it doesn't completely prevent the infection, it could potentially attenuate the degree of infection. So if you got a large viral load and it only knocks out 50% of those virus particles, it may decrease the severity, the clinical severity of your infection. But again, those are things that we would have to explore in the clinical trials in order to determine how best to use it in society, depending on the results of those trials.
Okay, you explained what antibodies are, but I was surprised I haven't really heard of these in the past. Is this something that has been like a field of research? Like, why haven't we heard about these before?
So it's interesting because they're genetically engineered. We don't usually use nanobodies, as far as I know, as any therapeutic. But certainly there doesn't seem to be a barrier as to why we can't. I just think it's not something that has previously been developed as a molecular therapeutic, but it has that potential. And there are a limited number of laboratories that are developing this, and that could be one of the reasons that maybe they haven't had as much uptake.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about another potential exciting development. So Russia is saying that they've developed a coronavirus vaccine. What do we know about what they've developed so far?
Actually, we know very little about what's going on with the Russian coronavirus vaccine, and it almost feels like we had nothing and now something has dropped out of the sky. So personally, I have not seen any phase 1 or phase 2 data on this vaccine, and I've heard limited reports from the former commissioner of the FDA that it's been studied in 100 or fewer patients. So at this point, I think this vaccine should be approached with a lot of skepticism and caution, because it has not really been proven to be efficacious or safe, which are the two big milestones that every vaccine has to clear before we can start using it in the general population.
Okay, now this also seems, let me rephrase this. So it seems like this vaccine was developed really fast. Do we have reason to be worried?
It's not so much the speed of development that worries me as it is the integrity of the scientific data behind it. So people have often raised concerns about Operation Warp Speed and the fact that we're developing vaccines here in the United States on a much more accelerated time course than the 10 to 15 years it normally takes. And as a scientist and a physician, I'm comfortable with that as long as there is enough volume of data. So what we really need are those large phase 3 clinical trials, because that's looks for small signals. It picks up noise and tells us whether those will turn into real signals. The Russian vaccine doesn't have those large phase 3 clinical trials. And as I said, some reports are saying only a few hundred or perhaps even less than 100 patients that it's been studied in. So if there's a small signal, safety signal, we need a lot more people to pick it up and to amplify it. So with Operation Warp Speed, we've got many different phase 3 trials going simultaneously. So we are getting that volume of data that we really need to be confident about the safety and the efficacy, but that's not the case with the Russian vaccine.
You're talking about these signals that kind of show that there might be a safety problem. Just out of curiosity, like what are some issues that vaccines tend to run into when it comes to safety problems?
So that's a great question. So the first question is, in terms of side effects induced by the vaccine that you wouldn't have expected. So when you give somebody a vaccine, you're essentially turning on their immune system and training it how to fight a mimic of the virus so that when it sees the real virus, it can fight it. But if you give them the vaccine and the immune system turns on and starts doing things that it's not supposed to do, like attacking parts of the body or organs of the body because it gets confused or it's acting indiscriminately, that could certainly be a safety signal that we worry about. We also worry about a phenomena called immune sensitization, which is essentially like an allergy. So if you think about a peanut allergy, the first time you're exposed to a peanut, you don't actually have a life-threatening allergic reaction. Your immune system looks at it and says, oh, this is an invader that I need to learn how to fight. The second time you're exposed to that peanut, the immune system kicks into overdrive, and that's when you have that allergic reaction that you need to rush to the hospital. So the same kind of thing can happen with a vaccine. It actually exposes you to a virus mimic. It trains your immune system to fight the virus, but the immune system overreacts the second time that it sees the virus. Instead of just fighting it and clearing the infection, it actually has a life-threatening reaction, which is a phenomena of immune sensitization. And that's what we as scientists always worry about in terms of vaccine safety. And then the third part of it is, does it work? Is it efficacious? Because it can work in the test tube and it can work in animals, but when we give it to humans, we then have to wait for the tincture of time for the nature to expose the person that was injected with the vaccine naturally, and then see if it worked to fight off the infection. And then the final piece of it is, how long do those antibodies last? So if it induces a protective response that only lasts for a month, that's probably not going to be very clinically beneficial. So those are the types of things that a phase 3 trial helps us to determine before we start giving it to millions and millions or billions of people.